Good morning, my name is Nikki, I'm the Obsessive Bookseller, and today I would like to review The Dragonbone Chair, Book 1 in Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams. I mentioned this in a post of fantasy books that I own that I'd like to get to sooner than later, and a relative slew of you came out of the woodworks to tell me how much you loved this series. So I bumped it up in the priority list on your recommendations, and I don't hate that I read it. Tad Williams is one of the few mainstream classic fantasy writers that I hadn't tried anything from. I went into this expecting a pretty slow burn fantasy novel, which I don't mind as long as I am engaged with the characters, and I pretty much got what I signed up for. The beginning was very much an exploration of some of the mundane things that happen in day-to-day castle life. I liked that right out of the gate Simon wasn't very savvy with things. I figured that would be a good opportunity for a lot of character growth. I really loved Rachel the dragon. I thought she was a fun character profile. And basically I could see all the pieces for a really good fantasy novel coming together, and I was willing to wait through some of the more relaxing prose to get there. And immediately out of the gate, I could see how beautifully this was written. The writing was incredibly flowy, poetic, beautiful, relaxing. It felt like getting a warm hug from my book. And then some stuff went down in chapter 12 and I was totally hooked, totally on board. I'm like, okay, this is what I signed up for. And then we went through a slog. I kind of half bookmarked it here. So this passage here, it's about 100 pages or so, maybe 120 pages. Was all about the character getting from point A to point B, kind of just wandering around, and I was like, okay, y'all said it was slow and it takes a while to get going. That was the point where I thought, when exactly is it going to get going here? Because I do have patience, but I don't know if I have this much patience. And it did get better, picked up a little bit, met a few more characters, made it work. I couldn't help but drawing a comparison between me asking when does it get good and people asking me when the Hobb books get good, Robin Hobb's Elderling series. There are a lot of people who are abandoning the series after the first trilogy because it's very slowly paced. The difference between that one and this one for me is that in the Elderling series, I was completely engaged with all the characters. They had so much depth, I felt so connected to all of them. And in this one, I'm not really connected to any of the characters. Even Simon. There are a couple that I'm more interested in than others, and when their scenes came up, I kind of lit up a little bit like, oh, okay, great. But for the most part, even then, I feel like the characters didn't have a lot of depth and kept me at arm's distance. Please don't yell at me. So I kept reading because the writing was beautiful and the story was interesting. And I knew there was going to be some sort of payoff because this many people cannot love this series for nothing. But I felt myself a little apathetic to what was happening. And then somewhere around the 75% mark, it felt like I was reading a completely different book. Suddenly, there are dozens of characters to keep track of. Things are moving, things are happening. It's like, whoa! Okay, wait, I'm not ready for this. I was in it for the slog. I was plodding away and suddenly you hit me over the head with content. Really good content, stuff that I was really excited to read about. However, at this point in the book, I was so disengaged with the characters that I didn't know I had to keep track of the new people that were being introduced because I wasn't sure if they were going to stick around or not. So by the time I realized that this was the new shape of the novel, it was already too late. I had already lost track of a few things, and I wasn't about to go back and reread. So I figured, okay, I'll just figure it out as I go along, and for the most part, I really enjoyed the ending of the book. There were a couple of side characters where when something happened to one of them, I went, oh crap, I don't even remember who they were or that they were in this scene at all. So that was kind of awkward. I do get lost occasionally on heavy fantasy novels, especially when I do audio like I did for this one, but I'm usually attentive enough to go back and make sure I understood what's going on before continuing the story. In this case, I just didn't care that much. And it's not because it was poorly written, it's because it's just not the type of story that I love. So if you are a Tolkien fan or a Robert Jordan fan, this is going to be your jam. The journey is more important than the destination. This is supposed to make you feel like you're sitting around a campfire being told this beautiful, gorgeous story of magic, adventure, revenge. There's plenty of stories within the stories where they go off on these tales of lore in this world, and I just was not on board. This is not a rant review. This was a decent read. I'm still giving it 3 stars. It's just not one of my all-time favorites like some of the other stuff that I've been reading lately. So overall, this was a good book. I'm glad I read it. I would like to read the next one. The writing was beautiful enough, and I loved some of the components that he introduced at the end of the book, and I would like to see where it goes. I think the swords are really cool. And now we get into other books you might like. First and foremost, the Lord of the Rings trilogy by J.R.R. Tolkien. You can tell that this had heavy influence from this series, which is fine because Dragonbone Chair marks the next step in the fantasy evolution, in my opinion. So the writing quality is comparable, the atmosphere is comparable, the characters are comparable, the story is comparable. So basically, if you've read one but not the other, then you're missing a match made in heaven here. Next, in the same vein, I mentioned it in the video, The Eye of the World, Book 1 in the Wheel of Time series, which recommending this one at this point is kind of a moot thing because everybody and their dog is reading it because of the show. But when you finish Wheel of Time, if you loved it, pick up Tad Williams. Next, The Belgariad, starting with Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings. This is a compilation of the first 2 books. I found this one incredibly comparable as well to those other series that I mentioned, but it was written so much more concisely. I love the pacing a lot more, I love the story trajectory a lot more, and of all the classic fantasy writers that I've read, this is one of my favorite ones. Next, Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. A little bit about the journey over destination, for sure, but you're so wrapped up in the characters that you don't really care. But if you're in for a slow burn that takes a while to get going, and chances are if you like Tad Williams, you're okay with that, this is a must-read. It is so good. It gets so beautiful, but it takes a while to get going. That's what everybody said to me about Dragonbone Chair. Just keep going with it. It takes a while. My favorite series of all time. And then a newer favorite, Shadow of What Was Lost, the Lycanius trilogy by James Islington. This has all of the classic fantasy elements, but with a modern plot. So it's a little more complex, it's a little more dynamic. I find it wildly more interesting, but it still has that classic fantasy feel, and the villains have a classic fantasy feel. This is one of the coolest things I've ever read, and I highly recommend it. And I think this would be a great recommendation for those who, like me, enjoyed Dragonbone Chair, but didn't love it, and this has all of the elements that I felt that one lacked. Thank you so much for joining me for this review, and I hope to catch you next time. Bye.